All right, everyone, let's take a look at delivering a final mix to someone and a few other options associated with that. So here I have the song, got my final mix done. We've created stems, but we're going to show you how to create stems a different way as well. Let me just close all these folders up. Here I have all the folders down. I can expand them out to the tracks as I want. All right, so we know we need to make a timeline selection from ideally the right before the song begins to a few seconds after it ends to leave that time for the song to fade out or noise or whatever. You don't want to get too close to the end of the song. Okay, so point 100 point, because those are my marker locations. Remember that Command 5 on the keypad brings up the locations. There we go. All right, let me go ahead and turn my shortcut keys on in case that is relevant to this. I always forget to do that. 1 second here. There we are. Okay, back to Pro Tools. So my timeline selection is set. It doesn't really matter if it's on one track or all the tracks. Timeline selections, when bouncing, don't necessarily relate to the specific track you're bouncing on. So that is done. Now, I could do the long method of going File, Bounce, Mix, but I don't want to do that. I want to learn that shortcut, Option Command B for bounce. Whoops, and it's come up with a bunch of extra things here. All right, so this is what it'll look like when you open this up in the new version of Pro Tools. So here we have name, we want to do the location, etc. Our mix source, like I mentioned before, I want that to be the output, not the physical output. So output 1 and 2, that's good. Interleaved, 24, 48. 48 is our, actually 44.1 is our native session format, so I want that to be 44.1. Wave files, we have some options here. Wave or broadcast wave file will store time information where it occurs on the timeline. That's good. AIFF files do not store time information. Their files will always begin at 0 seconds. Broadcast waves are different. MP3s also do not store time information. And of course, MP3s have some issues. More about that in a minute. MXF, actually, I'm not sure what that is yet. So that's a new thing, and I haven't looked into this at all. So I'm going to have to look in to see what an MXF is and figure that out. I think it's a video file format. Okay, so this all looks right. Now, I might very well want to choose a different directory and choose like a mix folder, but for now I'm just going to leave the mix file in the bounced files folder. What I typically like to do is label something typically with the date. So let's call this 2020 1/12/03 U in universe, no spaces, U in universe. Then I'm going to do underscore mix underscore 1. By doing the underscore 1, every time I do a new mix, it'll automatically give it sequential suffix numbers. So if I need to bounce this down again, it'll be mix underscore 2, underscore 3, without me having to do it automatically. That's good because oftentimes you'll end up with 4 or 5 different mix versions by the time's all said and done. Okay, so I'm happy with this. And I would just go ahead and bounce that to disk. Right, I'm just going to cancel this because we don't need to wait. All right, pretty easy. That's going to be the highest quality format for what we're doing. Now, let's backtrack just a little bit. Let's take a look at the master fader for this. So, of course, we want to make sure that the master fader is at a point where it's not clipping, but we also want to make sure that we're at the upper end of its range. So we've got a couple different levels to look at here. We have the fader level, and we have the audio level of what I played back. If you play back the entire mix, it'll give you the peak level in there. So I just want to make sure that I'm okay. Now I know that I need to be down here to be at the right mix level. So I'm just going to leave it there. Sometimes you might want to add some additional processing on the master bus. In this case, I put a bus compressor on early on in the mix process. Don't put a bus compressor on at the end of the mix process. You're actually working against yourself. You can use if you're putting a bus compressor on at the end of a mix, you're better off just doing the mix without the bus compression and doing that bus compression in mastering. But I mixed into the compressor, which if you are using a bus compressor, that's the way to do it. It takes some practice and experience to do that well. So be cautious with doing that, but don't necessarily shy away from it. It's very common in rock and pop mixing to put a bus compressor on very early in the mix process and mix into it. Okay, at this point, I could potentially put other processing on like EQs or anything else I wanted. Again, I would avoid doing virtually any processing at this point unless you're mixing into it, with one exception sometimes. So sometimes you might want to put a limiter on in the mix process at the very end. Don't do it by default. It doesn't substitute for having good gain structure and keeping a good eye on your master faders, but a limiter can give you an option to make a mix a little bit louder. Now, my recommendation and our general recommendation would be that you save a mix down without any limiting, and then you might want to do another mix down with some limiting, and then give that mix down version to the band to listen to. Otherwise, they're definitely going to call you or text you and say the mix is too quiet. If you're mixing with any kind of dynamic range, the mix will be too quiet. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's take a look at Insight. All right, I'm going to cover this quickly. You're going to cover this in depth in A202, but it's good to have a little introduction to it. Let's talk about LUFS, loudness units full scale. A loud pop or rock song on the radio today, a commercially released song, the LUFS is going to be somewhere between -8 and -9. It could be as loud as -5. That is crazy loud. It's really hard to do. When you're mixing down with dynamics, depending on the style of the song, you're probably want to go between -22 or 23 and -14 or so. Let's see where this one's at. I'm jumping forward just a little bit here.
Nobody told you it was going to be this way. Life doesn't come with instructions.
Great, so I'm around -22, 23, whatever. Close enough. That's pretty dynamic, and it's going to definitely sound way quieter than other things that people will be listening to off of their phone or computer or whatever. So a band would find this unacceptable. They would definitely complain to you about it. However, having this kind of dynamic range going into a mastering situation is good. It gives you some control. So for doing a band mix, maybe let's try putting a limiter on. You have some limiters optional. One you'll have included with and a few. Those limiters great. So are some of the waves and the slates, but this is also a really good limiter. It gives you some nice controls as well. Since you likely don't have insight in your own systems, it does give you some LUFS numbers, which is really very handy. Let's take a look at what this says.
Nobody told you it was going to be this way. Life doesn't come with instructions.
Great. So our LUFS is right around the same. That's good. For my mix to the band, I'm going to set the ceiling, the maximum level that I could ever go, to about -0.5 or so. That's close enough. Some of these character controls will change depending on the style of the music, but I wouldn't worry about it too much for a band mix. If you're doing mastering, that's a different thing. You'll deal with that in 202. So what I want to do is get this to a level that sounds loud, but doesn't really destroy the overall sonic qualities of the mix. And I'll show you both versions of that. Okay, I'm going to just begin turning the threshold down. As I turn the threshold down, it has automatic gain makeup, so it's going to get louder and louder and louder. And watch the LUFS increase as I turn this down. I'm going to first go for about -14. We'll see how much limiting we're doing.
Nobody told you it was going to be this way. Life doesn't come with instructions. You wake up and embrace every day, not knowing if you're everything or nothing. You put the you in universe. Yeah, the world is yours and you're the world.
Okay, so that doesn't sound bad. The limiting was pretty gentle. -14 is going to be still on the quiet side of a commercial mix. So I'm going to try and get this closer to -10, and let's see if the limiter starts to sound pretty bad.
Nobody told you it was going to be this way. Life doesn't come with instructions. You wake up and embrace every day, not knowing if you're everything or nothing. You put the you.
Ugh. It's pretty bad right there. So that's too much limiting. I definitely want to go in between. So if I wanted to get this into that -8, -9 range, I need to re-look at my mixing process, because I'm never going to get it out of limiting alone. It's just not going to work. But I'm going to just stick around -14 or -13, -12, somewhere in that range will be just fine for the band to listen to. Okay. At this point, with the limiter, most limiters have some dithering controls built in, but not all. And actually, I rarely use this limiter. I usually use isotope. So this particular limiter I don't believe has dithering or quantizing built into it. So I'm going to go ahead and put a program on there that'll do it. We'll just put dither on. And if we're going to send them a 16-bit file, we want to make sure that dither and noise shaping is on down to 16 bits. If you're going to give them a full 24-bit file, no need to worry about it. Okay, so after that's all done, you just make sure your area is selected, 0.1 point, 0.100 point. There we go, and bounce to disk. And we'll go ahead and give them a 16-bit file for now. Okay, we're almost done here. I could also, at this point, choose to bounce down the stems at the same time as the master. Remember, we bounced down stems already. By clicking the plus sign under Mix Source, you can add as many sources as you want. So here we have all these different options here. Let me get rid of the redundant options. All right, so I could bounce down all these different stems in one fell swoop. It's all done, and then I can send it off to the label, and we're set. Okay, now let's say that I do this all the time. That took a while to set that up. I could make this a preset. I'm going to Control-click on one. Whoops, I think I did that wrong. It should be Option-click. I did it backwards. Let me go do this again. Okay, Alt 1, 2, and we're just going to select all those. Okay, whoops, get rid of that one. Now I'm going to do Command-click on one, and that'll store that preset. Okay, I'm going to delete all these. If I click this preset, it has all this stuff set up, and I can specify locations, names. This is a new feature to Pro Tools 2020.11. All right. So being able to quickly and easily bounce down mixes clearly with good labeling, very important. It'll speed your workflow up, and you don't want to spend too much time doing some of this stuff, because you'll end up wasting a lot of your own personal time rather than paid time in a lot of cases. All right, part 2 is going to cover some encoder